A little bit about me. I am the founder and the CEO of UX Writers Collective. We offer online courses in UX writing, content research and testing, chatbot writing and design, and a fourth course that we have is CX writing or marketing writing. You could think of that one. I am a past head of UX content strategy for Google. I was also a senior UX manager at Intuit for QuickBooks. So that's a little bit about who you're listening to today. What we'll cover in today's webinar, how UX writing evolved as its own discipline. So every once in a while, we know UX is always in flux. We have motion designers and we have visual designers and we have all these niche, we have UX prototypers and UX engineers. So it wasn't that surprising that we also grew into a discipline as UX writing. But we'll talk a little bit about how that came to be. And we'll give a few examples of writing for interfaces so that you know what UX writing is and how it works. And then we'll talk about some best practices so that you have something to take back to your work after today. And we'll also provide some resources for you. And then, of course, we'll have a Q&A session at the end, as Aslam mentioned. So, as I said, I grew up in Silicon Valley back when the whole internet was really rough. It was very hard to use. And software developers did most of the writing for applications. And that didn't work out very well, not because software developers aren't awesome. They are very awesome, but maybe language is not, their top skill. They're coders. And so we got errors like you see here. And that was very frustrating for users. So we had designers who came into the picture. UX evolved as a discipline. And designers started to say, hey, businesses, if you have great user experience, if you have great flows and you have delight and visual interest in your applications, you're going to sell a lot more and you're going to be much more successful. And so that was amazing. So design in general came into the picture. But then UX writers started working closely with designers. And part of the reason for that is that many UX designers have, first thing, English as a second language, or so that their skills are in redlining and CSS complicated fixes, and a lot more of the technical side of design fell on designers, and UX writers stepped in to help with the writing portion of the work. When you look at user interfaces, obviously, a ton of a user interface is just text. And so the more we had somebody focusing on what that text experience was like, the better and more compassionate UIs became. And of course, that made software much more pleasant to use. And the companies that did that best really were the most successful. So a lot of UX writers evolved from technical writers and marketing copywriters who started to work on user interface text as well. Okay, so we know that UX writers fix the grammar and the spelling and tell you what to put on a button. But what else do UX writers contribute to a design team? UX writers look across the entire customer journey. And when you talk about content strategists do this as well, but they might be dealing with content that lives outside of the product. And UX writers really focus on customer-facing text. So they'll start looking in the marketing website, and then they'll move into the product copy, and then they'll even move into support writing to make sure that each transition in that customer journey is smooth and works well for the user. UX writers also help to bring a cohesive experience between products, devices, and modes. And products, a lot of times, you know, if you use Salesforce, you might have 3 third-party applications that you're using along with Salesforce. So someone has to make those products work well together. For devices, we know that you might start a task on your mobile device and you might move to a desktop, and you expect that product to reflect that, know where you've been, and speak to you as if you are picking up that new task on the next device very smoothly. And then modes. By mode, I mean interaction mode. So you have, you know, swiping and gestures on mobile, you have typing on a desktop, typing and mouse clicking, and then you also have voice. And so when I worked at Google Payments, for example, we had to think about modes across the types of devices were crazy. So you might talk to your car, you might talk to your TV, you might talk to your Google Home device. And so these interaction modes, now instead of just a mobile device and a desktop, you might also have a voice interaction mode. And the writer will be responsible for helping to ensure, along with the designers, of course, that all of that works well together. And a lot of times we know that a designer might focus on one of those modes, whereas the UX writer will look across those modes and help to connect them in a way that works well for users. UX writers also have a storytelling approach to looking across that whole customer journey. And what we would do is we would look at the narrative. What story are we telling to users? We're beginning our story in marketing. Here's what the product can do for you. Here's how it will improve your life. And you're telling the user a story about your product and them. And that's a little bit of the narrative aspect of the work. And then, of course, UX writers are very passionate about guiding users through tasks and having empathy and compassion for those users, because using software isn't always easy. It can be very hard, especially if you're using complex software like enterprise tools, or even trying to file your taxes. You know, things like that can be very difficult. So that's what a UX writer does. A very simple way to think of UX writers is that they're interaction designers for words. So while most designers are focusing on visual specs and you know, click-through flows, UX writer will be looking at the flow of the words across that experience. So let's talk about a little bit about how important it is to have a UX writer. Many teams don't have a UX writer, and the one thing that I will say is that they are so worth it. And or we, I guess I should say we, because I'm one. The way that UX writing impacts the success of the software is huge. So a lot of times designers write this text and they do an awesome job. Many designers are very good UX writers. But UX writers will look at the experience in a slightly different way. And they're really looking at how to remove friction in the language and the text. And that's different than removing friction from things like a button that doesn't go where you expect it to. It's more like if a customer has a question and they don't have an answer, they're going to drop off. So we'll provide the answer. So I'll tell you a little story. This is from Jared Spool, and he wrote an article about how important it was to have good writing in your software. I won't make you guys read this whole big block of text. Instead, I'll show you a quick mock-up of what this story is telling. So what Jared Spool's story is about is that there was a software application that asked people to fill in a bunch of information and then register. And many people don't want to commit to creating an account. They just want to buy something, or they just want to get something done quickly, and they're not interested in an account that continues beyond their one transaction. And so what Jared Spool did is he changed the button. Instead of register, which had this big, heavy sounding impact, it just said continue. And then he put this little conversational note in here. And I will tell you guys, this is way, way too wordy and long. So Jared Spool's writing his spirit is great. He wants to say to the user, don't worry about creating an account. You can just click continue and you can just check out. You don't have to create an account. You can if you want. And that removed the friction. And according to Jared Spool's story, it led to an increase in sales of $300 million in this one instance from just changing button text, just changing a CTA. So what UX writers do is we create a conversation with users. So rather than saying, user, click this button, user, click this dropdown, user, take this next step, what we're doing is we're saying, user, you are trying to get something done. We understand that. How can we help? What information do you need? And we're going to be constantly looking at the experience, trying to understand how to smooth away that friction and how to keep the user moving forward in the experience. So our job is to create these constructive conversations with users. Okay, so let's get into a little bit about how UX writing works, what exactly UX writers do. When a UX writer looks at a dialogue, and we all know we write lots of dialogues, but there are actually some pretty simple rules for creating a dialogue that works every single time. And some of those, I have a document of content heuristics, which is really just a checklist of rules for components. So if you ask the user a question, this is a Google dialogue, do you want to delete all of these items from your account? So there's just a single question. It's very specific. The body text explains any consequences, and it will give the user a little more information about what will happen if they take that action. And then in the button text, we see that the buttons are actually answers to the question that's asked in the headline. UX writers know that users will often skip body text. And so UX writers will always know to make the headline everything the user needs to know, and the button text is the answer. So that's sort of how a UX writer looks at a dialogue. Which is not to say that that's not how designers look at dialogues. I'm sure it is, as well as researchers. But a UX writer is really thinking about just the user's mental model and the user's mental space and taking those actions and helping them through that. So let's look at a dialogue that isn't working. So this is a terrible dialogue. We all can recognize that. And yet, as users, we see these still. Even with the rise of UX writing, we'll still see error messages or messaging that's confusing, doesn't make sense, doesn't tell the user how to get past it, doesn't tell the user how to solve their problem. And so we see an example like this where a UX writer would say, oh man, that's so bad, let's fix it. But this is from a working product, so somebody thought this was okay, which is a little crazy. So you can see that this obviously doesn't tell the user what to do, doesn't tell the user how to fix the error, and so it's not a great dialogue. Okay, now we'll get into a little bit more of a meaty example. And one of the things I'd ask you guys to do is look at the screen, and we'll give it what I call the squint test. And a squint test is a test of information hierarchy. So if we sort of, squint up your eyes and you look at this screen, it's very hard to understand what the main important message is. We know add phone is there really big, so that's the action we're taking. So that's easy to understand, but then the rest of this text just sort of blurs together, and you really have to work hard. There's a lot of cognitive load to understand what you're supposed to do on the screen. So I'll give you a little bit of background. For Google account security, users had an option to add a phone for two-factor authentication. And this is where you would take the step to add the phone for this security step. And I'm not showing the screens before, and I'm not showing the screens after, because I just want to focus on how a UX writer would view this one screen. So let's take a look at this one. We'll break it down. And here's an inventory of this screen text. And you can see that there's just a ton here. There's a lot of stuff. It's a ton of information to parse. I don't know about you guys, but I got hives looking at this yellow text. That really drove me a little crazy because yellow, no. Okay. And in this example, we can look at our options for what we can remove to actually get to the point. So a UX writer will often look at a screen like this that contains a lot of valuable information, but some of it is redundant, unnecessary, and really doesn't help the user to get to pick a phone and move forward. So let's look at a redesign. And here's the original on the left. And then we look on the right and we see that when we reduced all of this copy and all of this text, we got this to a much simpler state. So the headline tells us everything we need to know. Instead of just add a phone, which is confusing, you know, you don't necessarily understand why you're adding a phone. Add a phone for secure sign-in will say why. And users often need to know not just what or how, but why, so that they buy into something and understand it and say, yes, that's great. Okay, and this screen was auto checking for screen lock. And there was, up here it says, we recommend using a phone with screen lock. Here it's automatically checked that the user has screen lock. So that's a little bit redundant. And so this message here just says, your phone has screen lock, perfect. So the user knows that there's no problem there, they're ready to go forward. And then here we have a message that says, don't use a shared device. And I don't know about you, but I don't necessarily like Google telling me don't use a shared device. I might want to use a shared device, maybe with my kids, my husband. You know, sharing a device might be important. So we say, if you share this phone with others, they can access your account using the sign-in code. Only share with people you trust. So we've softened that message to not sound so much like a command from Google, don't share your phone. And so that's an example of how a UX writer would revise a screen that has a lot of text on it. So here in this screen, we have about 70 words. And in this screen, we have about 40 words. So we've really reduced the cognitive load for users by getting to the point and trying to make it as simple and clear as possible. And also introducing a little more respect for the user's autonomy. If they want to share a phone, go ahead, share a phone, but understand the consequences. So that's an example there. So let's talk about UX writing best practices. When you are a UX writer, we have these are really the three pillars: be clear, be concise, and be helpful. And these are the same as any product manager or designer would embrace these. They would say, yes, of course, this is what we want to do. But how do we do that? So one of the ways that we work on being clear in our language is listening to customers and using the language that customers use. So if you guys have worked on product teams, a lot of times when software is in development or applications are in development, the team will have some working names or some placeholder names for features, for the product itself, for the next update. And quite often, everybody sort of is so used to the words that we use internally that those will even end up in the external customer-facing text. And we don't want to do that. We want to listen to customers. How do customers talk about this task? How do customers talk about what is happening in the software? Use their language, and then they're guaranteed to understand what's happening. Be concise. So concise just means be brief. Obviously, only say what you need to say. And that actually can be harder than it sounds, of course. Some people will need more information. Some people will need less. So we often have a range of users from super low tech people all the way up to developers or people who are very technical and use a ton of software every day. And we want to make sure that we are accounting for that whole span of user types. And so we want to say only what we need to say, and then we want to give extra information for people who need it. And we might do that through linking out to a help file, for example. Okay. And then we want to be helpful, and we want to guide users. We want to reassure them. We want to empathize with them. And let's look at a couple of examples here. Okay. So this was a very controversial notification that Google used for a short time. And you can see if you were on your phone and you got this message, sign in from a new device, account accessed from an unknown device. So first things first, you really can't even tell that this is a Google message and that this is your Google account. So even though this sounds informal and friendly, it's not clear. We don't know what this message means, sign in from a new device. Do you mean me? Do you mean, do I want to sign in from a new device? So it's confusing. And that message actually led to a lot of support calls and cost the company money. And this is why UX writers will save companies a lot of money and help users a lot. Okay, let's look at a concise example. So we want to be brief and simple. So concise means being brief and simple, but we don't want to lose context. So we want to make sure that it's short, but it still makes perfect sense to users. So we don't want to lose that context. In this example, there's a link here to a video from Google I/O 2017 where my team did a presentation on UX writing, and it's quite interesting. So if you get a chance, do watch it. This is an example shown by Allison Rung, one of my coworkers. And in this message, she's going through and revising a message about a user entering an incorrect password. So we know this is a super common message. People see these all the time. Like, updating your password is one of the most frequent tasks for any application. So it better work well. So we see here, you entered an incorrect password. Okay, that sounds a little bit like we're blaming the user. You dum-dum, you entered an incorrect password, and incorrect sounds a little persnickety, right? So it sounds a little bit like we're calling out that user, you know, and not being very friendly. So we shorten it and simplify it, and we say, wrong password. And then our action is okay. So if we extend this example, okay is not helpful. So we also want to be helpful and straightforward. So we don't want to be helpful in a way. It's interesting because some cultures include a ton of formal, flowery language like, please, my dear user, do this thing for us. Thank you so much. But all of that politeness is actually sort of also getting in the way of the user getting their task done. So we don't want to include that. We want to be straightforward and just say, here's what to do. And so we change the button text, try again, or recover your password. Okay, so that's an example of how to be clear, how to be concise, and how to be helpful. So always think about, does the user have a next step? A very surprising thing that I notice sometimes as a UX writer is you'll get to a point in an application and it is really not clear what the next step is that a user needs to take. And part of that happens, I think, because as product teams, we're so used to understanding what a user needs to do that we won't look at a screen and say, is there a CTA that's very clear for the user? Is there a next step that's super clear? So that's one of the things UX writers will look at. Another thing UX writers do is they'll focus on voice and tone. And I'm sure everybody has heard about voice and tone. So we mentioned being informal, friendly, helpful. Those are all about voice and about tone. So this is one of the tools that we developed when I was at Google. And this is a tone map. And this tone map has sort of whimsical, happy, friendly, positive, and then it has serious. And this is more of a tone that you would take for error messages. Or maybe if somebody had been suspected of fraud, you would have some pretty serious sounding fraud emails that you would send. They would not joke, they would not be whimsical, they would be pretty serious, very straightforward. But then let's talk about this, this happier side of the tone map. So of course, when we're welcoming a user, we want to be very welcoming and happy and upbeat. We want to let them know all the possibilities for this app, how it can help them. During onboarding, we want to be less whimsical and less overly exuberant. And the reason is that onboarding is a very important educational step for users. So in the onboarding steps, we want to let users know what's possible. We want to introduce them to the benefits and the value of the application, but we also want to make sure that we're very clear, what does the application do? How can it help them? How can it improve their life and solve their problem? And so onboarding will be a little less exuberant. And then we have some other moments here where we might get into the whimsical realm for tone. So that's another way that UX writers will look at across the experience and understand what are all those touch points where we're speaking to the customer. Are we using the right tone? Are we using the right language? Are we using the brand voice correctly? And that's a way that UX writers will work with voice and tone. Okay, another best practice that UX writers look at is how specifically we're echoing messages and terms throughout the customer journey. So here we have a typical sales funnel. So a customer comes to the marketing site, they read the marketing copy, they sort of understand that they need this thing, they make a decision to purchase. So a thing to kind of understand is that language, when it repeats, actually helps a user become comfortable, helps a user to begin to form, it educates them, it helps them form an opinion, it helps them understand that they need or don't need a product. So a little more closely looking at this, when the user is in the marketing realm, they might read about something like a feature name for the first time. So let's say TurboTax. Oh gosh, this is an international audience. This will be harder. So when you want to file taxes in the United States, you might use an application called TurboTax. TurboTax connects to another tax filing application. QuickBooks connects to TurboTax. TurboTax connects to a tax filing step. And when you're selling this feature, you're going to use certain words to describe this fantastic ability to use your accounting software, and then send it to a tax application. And the important thing is that what the user reads in the marketing realm, they also see in the product. So as they read that marketing material, they begin to build a mental model of what that product or feature can do for them. If we don't use the same language, then the user will have doubt, confusion, and they won't feel like they're satisfied because they'll feel like they didn't get what they wanted. So here's a little example of how UX writers look at the user journey. So let's say the user makes a purchase, they visit the marketing website, they read this name of a thing, a feature, and they read it for the first time, and they, in the beginning, they're sort of like, oh, new thing. Okay, so the next thing they do is they build this mental model. They start to understand how this tool, feature, product, or app can help them in their life. And then they decide to download and install that. And then during onboarding, they're going to be introduced to the application. They're going to step through those tour screens, and then they're going to land probably on something that is an empty state. And in that empty state, we want to use the same language that we used in the marketing. So those are the kinds of, it sounds obvious, but when you are a UX writer, you notice that very, very often it's not the same language used, because one team is writing in marketing and another team is writing on the product team or the design team. And there's often a pretty huge disconnect between the marketing writers and the product team and the way they're expressing those features and functions in the product. So once the user gets to active use, they're going to start their first task. They're hopefully going to see the value that they were looking for. They're going to engage with more features. Then they might go to the support site to self-help. And again, we want to use the same language in the support site. So when we're in big companies, at Google, and I understand that Google is a weird company because it's huge, it's so giant. There were hundreds of writers who worked in the support teams, and there were, not as many, but a lot of writers for the marketing and design teams. And those big teams didn't always talk. And so we want to make sure that the support team is reviewing the marketing and the product copy. And we want to make sure that the marketing and the product teams are looking at the support copy. So we want to make sure that those connections are happening across the entire user experience. And we want to make sure that they're happening for, again, devices, modes, and the sites like the marketing site and the support site. So that's a little bit about another UX writing best practice. If you guys haven't, I would encourage you to do two things in your products. Number one, step outside of your design mode and use the product like a user would. And that sounds, again, so obvious, but very often on product teams, the team itself does not test out the product. People are getting much better at that, so that's great. But test out the product, and when you see language that doesn't work or text that's confusing, those are the friction steps to focus on and fix, because users are going to experience the same thing. Another thing I would encourage everybody to do is talk to your customer support team, because those customer support agents are going to hear about the top problems in your product or your application. They often have to do with instructions. They might be interaction bugs or problems with interactions, but they're often language problems. And if you can talk to your support team, find out what those top issues are and fix them, again, you're going to remove a ton of friction. And that's something a UX writer can do. is connect with that support writer and make sure that there's alignment between the product and the support copy. Okay, so UX, of course, is about user happiness, but it is also about selling. It's about product success, and that means revenue. So when we think about our pluses for the user, we know this as designers that we want the user to feel success. We want them to feel loyalty for the product. And one of the things a UX writer does is look at relationship building with the customers. When you have loyalty, in other words, if you have compassion for your users and you have empathy for your users, they will share that empathy back with you. They'll be loyal. They'll forgive you when you maybe do have a bug and you say, I'm so sorry, users, let us fix that quickly. And you have compassion for them. This is going to actually make a big difference in the number of complaints and the user happiness. We want users to feel satisfied. We want them to understand what we promised them in the marketing. We want them to see that promise come true in the product. That's another thing a UX writer will look at. And then, of course, ease of use. We want clarity. We want to be concise. We want to be helpful. Okay. And then on the selling side, UX writers are not marketing writers, but they will often contribute to the marketing writing. And that's important because they, as I mentioned again, they help to connect those dots. UX writers look at storytelling. They're very involved in educating the user and providing instruction. So some low-level users might actually need tutorials. A UX writer will write those. They might work with a technical writer, they might work with a support writer, and they'll work closely with the product manager and the designer at all points to make sure that users are educated and understand instructions. We also want to reassure users, and that's a big part of our job. And when you combine all of these things, you're hugely contributing to product success. And when customers are happy, products sell. And we all know that's how we keep our jobs. That's what we want. Okay, so I want to tell a little story here. A friend and a UX writer who's been through our UX Writing Fundamentals program, Sasha Ray, she's a senior UX writer, and she posted on LinkedIn, and she said, "This is a message that I see a lot, and it sounds like this. Sorry, something's up, but don't worry. We have a bunch of really smart people working on it. Please check back in a while." And there's a lot of ways to look at this message. It sounds friendly. It sounds reassuring. You could say that it checks a lot of the boxes for all of the scope of the writing that I've just mentioned. But when we look at this message a little more analytically, we realize that we're bragging. We have a bunch of really smart people working on this. That just makes the user think we're arrogant, and we really don't want that. Humility is important. We're asking the users to use our product. They're a customer. We want to respect them. We want to give them specific information whenever we have it. So please check back in a while. If you absolutely have to say, please check back in a while, that's fine. Maybe you don't know how long it will take for this error to be fixed, but it's really not helpful. How long is a while? So, even please check back in a few minutes is more valuable. So specificity is important. But be sure in all of your writing and all of your UI text to really focus on the user. How are they feeling? How are they interpreting that text? Is it guiding them enough? And is it helping them? So just wanted to mention that, because you can even look like you're checking a lot of the boxes, but when you really dig in, we want to think of our users first, and that's a key component to good writing. in software. So, believe it or not, I'm wrapping up already. And one of the things I wanted to mention is that UX writing and content strategy are actually huge disciplines. So trying to introduce everyone to UX writing in a very short span of time is hard. These are some more links for you guys to follow and to learn a ton more about UX writing. There's a lot of info out there, and a lot of, if you look on Medium for things like best practices for writing for forms, you'll find a ton of examples for how to do UX writing well. So those are some links out to a lot more information. One of the things we didn't talk about is if you want to be a UX writer and work as a UX writer, how would you get started? So one of the things that when people come to the UX Writers Collective and they want to take our UX Writing Fundamentals course, they might be support writers, they might be marketing writers. Those guys are already working in tech, so they're pretty set. They kind of know what they're doing. They understand some design terms. Many designers, even product managers and marketers, often find that they really want to be UI writers, UI and UX writing, because like me, they're frustrated by bad UI writing. They love to focus on the words, they love to make the experiences great, and they know that writing is the key to making that work. So when you want to be a UX writer, you're going to be thinking a lot like a UX designer. You're going to need a portfolio and an education. In order to get a portfolio, you need some experience. So how do you get that experience? And I will tell you guys, there are some great, there's our course. I want to mention our course because you can be certified in UX writing. It's designed to help people understand what a UX writer does on a design team, who are the people you work with, what are the expectations of that role, and it sort of walks people through learning to do the job. And so you can learn a lot about how to do UX writing, but there's a bigger piece, which is how to work on a design team. And that's the harder part to pick up. So that's included in our course. When you want to create a portfolio, you'll need some examples of your writing. If you're a designer, you'll have those, which is awesome. If you're a product manager, you might have those as well. If you're coming from outside of the UX writing field, that might seem really, really hard to get examples. So you can run through the daily UX writing challenge, and I'll add that link to this deck before we send it out. The daily UX writing challenge is, it just gives you tiny little bite-sized examples of UI writing scenarios and then asks you to try writing them. So that's a really fun way to get started and try out some UI writing. The daily UX writing challenge, mention that one more time. And so that's a little bit about how to get started in UX writing. And this is the shameless plug. Do you want to get certified in UX writing? Come visit our website. And really, I just want to say thank you so much for attending today. This was very much an overview. There's a ton more that we could get into. I have a second webinar on content research and testing, for example, that you might want to find. And then, of course, there are lots of books and other ways to learn UX writing. If you're interested in taking our course, here is a code for 20% off for attendees. So with that, I'll hand it back over to you, Islam.
Awesome. Thank you, Bobbie. That was very insightful. I would say you barely scratched the surface on UX writing. There is so much more than this.
So
And
much more.
this was more like the awareness or introduction to that topic. I already have some questions here. Uh,
Sure.
I just wanted to say I tried actually the daily UX writing challenge, and it's amazing.
Cool.
It's really good. Highly recommend. So the first question is about UX writer portfolio.
Uh-huh.
So how to create that?
Yes. Okay. So a really hard thing. Well, I take that back. It's not really hard, but something that you have to learn, and there's a learning curve. If you're a writer, let's say you're just a copywriter, you might get away with writing things in Google Docs or Microsoft Word and handing those off to a product manager or a designer. And you'll never need to learn design tools. And you'll never need to learn how to mock up a screen. Um, there's a whole area called content design where you might start with your messaging and then you hand off to a designer after you've introduced some of the messaging and your vision of the writing and the content. And that's called content first design. So if you do something like the daily writing challenge, that's going to give you an opportunity to do the writing, but then you would want to mock up those examples. And if you mock up those examples using common patterns, so we know there are lots of common UX patterns. You might use material design. You might use the material design system components to mock those up. Those would be great. You could use the design system for your company to mock up those examples. So once you have those mock-ups, you could then put them into a portfolio and you could talk about how you approach that work. Just like designers have to be able to explain their rationale, their reason for designing the way they did, UX writers also need to have a very good understanding of the rationale behind their choices. So if you are creating a portfolio, you're going to want to include your story about how you approach this task. You're going to want to explain your rationale for why you chose the language you chose. And that would be one example of your writing that you could include in your portfolio. In the UX Writing Fundamentals class that we offer at the UX Writers Collective, the final project is to go through and to update the copy on an entire flow for a mobile app. It's a fictional mobile app, but then what students do is they can show before and afters, and that's very important for a portfolio. So if you take our course, you could show an example like that. Another way to get examples for your portfolio is to take a badly designed example that's anywhere out in public. So one of the ones I like to use is if you go to Facebook and you try to create an ad on Facebook, it's really hard. Their UI is not great for telling users what the steps are to create an ad. So when you go to that first page, try rewriting it. Look at that page. It's kind of like that exercise that I showed where there's a ton of text, but it's a lot to figure out. Get a bad example, one that bothers you. It can even be a little notification, and just rewrite it. It can be a notification, an error message. It can be instructions on screens. And what you'll want to do is just show the before, mock up your solution, and that's a great example for a portfolio. You can use tools like Wix. You can use Squarespace. There are a lot of sort of Insta portfolio products out there. So whatever tool you pick doesn't matter. The most important thing is that your portfolio sort of talks about your writing philosophy, a little bit about your experience, and don't forget your contact information because sometimes people actually forget that. So,
Awesome.
portfolios, yeah.
Thanks a lot. The second one is, when do we involve UX writing in the product development process? when is too early or when is too late? How does it fit?
That is an awesome, awesome question. I thought about including some of that in this presentation, but boy, did it go deep. So one of the things that happens commonly is that product managers and designers will work all the way through to a prototype stage without ever talking to a writer or a UX content strategist.
Yeah.
And then they'll say, hey, writer, can you, add the fluff? Can you make this sound good? And if anybody out there is a visual designer, you know that this can be very, very painful, because sometimes the problem is way back in the way the task flow is set up. So I would suggest that when you are creating a new product, you especially will involve a UX writer or a content strategist in your information architecture step. So when you're very first introducing, your navigation, for example, in an application, what are the words you're choosing for that navigation? What is the hierarchy below that navigation, and how are those terms aligning and explained? You're going to want to involve your UX writer all the way up in the research phase, because you want your UX writer to hear that customer language. And you want the UX writer to bring that customer language that we hear in user testing into the product. So I know everybody wants to be like at the front of the whole product design process. Everybody wants to be at the table. But, depending on, I'm going to add a little caveat to that. If you are revising screens, it's okay to bring a UX writer in just to revise copy, because you already know it's working and you're just fine tuning. When you are working on complex concepts where a user needs to build a new mental model, for example, that is a very, very important time to make sure that your UX writer is working closely with the product manager, the researcher, the designer, to make sure that everybody has consensus about how that information architecture and how that mental model is explained. So I would encourage you to think less of a UX writer as a copywriter, and think of that UX writer as an interaction designer for language. So that's an important differentiator between what a copywriter does and what a UX writer does.
I think it's still the maturity in organizations still too early for most companies. I mean, to have UX writers, and that's why.
True. Yeah. So one good thing is that if you get just one UX writer or just one content strategist and you task them with teaching everybody how to write. So a very good way to start is to get just one person, and that person will create a style guide. That person will have a list of preferred terms for the whole team to use. They'll give examples of the voice and tone and how that would look across the product. So if you get just one writer or one content strategist, they can set up some beginning important foundational pieces for the team to guide the team.
Good idea. So the next question is how to test the copy for apps, for example. Is there any methods to use? How do you test it?
So, holy moly. I love this topic so much that my partner in my business, my partner and I created a whole course on content testing and research. And in that course, we have 11 different methods for testing copy. I also have a webinar that I did separately from this one, and it goes through a lot of content testing methods. I would really encourage you to go seek that out. One of the things that I will say is that when you are building products, it's much harder to do things like A/B testing. And if you're doing something like a mobile app, So when you have installed products, you can't just change the copy on the fly. So you may need to do A/B testing in a prototype environment rather than in a live environment. If you're using a web application and everything is live, you can carve off a 5% test audience and you can A/B test on that 5%. If you are doing deeper testing, I would encourage you to do that in prototyping and user testing. Make sure your writer is in the room. I can't emphasize that enough. If your UX writer can't be there, be sure to share out videos of the sessions so that the UX writer can listen to those sessions and understand deeply what the user is looking for.
But there is an issue, Bobbie, for example, with other languages than English. So yes. I will give an example of Arabic language here in the region. And we often struggle with fitting like Arabic copy when we do the translation from English to Arabic, for example.
Yes.
How do we overcome this issue?
That's a hard question, but one that does have an answer. I mean, especially when you have some very easy guidelines to follow, and this is more design than UX writing, but UX writing can help guide this. For example, when you have a field label, put the field label on top of the entry box, not next to it. So that's a very simple rule that all companies should follow, so that when you have that label for that field, it can get longer and longer and longer, or it can even switch right to left and it won't impact the layout. So if you have a field label that's next to an entry and the field label grows and pushes that entry box over, you've just broken your layout. So we do know that there are some design rules to follow to make sure that we're accommodating for language change, and those translation and localization objectives are very specific to the culture and the country and the language. A good thing you can do is, if you have your UX writer on your original product team, pair them with your localization designer or your translator and make sure that the same message is happening in both situations, or that it's adjusted properly for the culture and the language that it's translating into.
Awesome. This is a question about the legislation text, like privacy policy.
Yes.
How do you see simplifying this language for users to understand? A big one.
Yeah, that's a hard question. There are some companies that do this really, really well. I'm trying to think of an example because I just saw one. Was it Dropbox? Of course, when we have these big legal texts, there isn't always a super simple way to shorten it because it's legalese, it's legal language, it's liability language, it's complex. But one of the things we can do is make sure, for example, that headings and subheadings in that legal text give a brief summary of what the rest means. So when we have a privacy policy, we can have a heading that says, "We will not share with third parties." Or that heading might say, "We will share with third parties in limited circumstances." And so if you can at least make sure that your privacy policy or your terms of service are scannable. So make sure that if a user goes through and reads the headings for your policies, that at least the headings give an overview of what the user is agreeing to. Especially in the US, I know you guys know the US is so just, everything is crazy with legal issues. So I have not found a simple way to shorten or make that easier, but we can at least make it scannable. I don't know if that answers the question, hopefully.
yeah, I think it needs more time, more elaboration. But
Yes.
a question that I think you discussed before: UX writers working with researchers to test
Yeah.
products or to test prototypes. Um, so involving them in the usability testing, for example, or an A/B testing with users.
Yes. Let me talk about that a little bit. And I talked about it a lot in the second webinar that I mentioned. So please go and watch that if this is an interest that you have.
Mhm.
Oftentimes, and I've seen this through the years of user testing, when you're running prototype tests, the copy is not written by a UX writer or a content strategist. It's placeholder copy. A lot of times designers are focused on the interaction flows and the visual emphasis, and they don't always make sure that instructions are clear. So a UX writer can help a ton with user research. They can help to write the scenarios. They can help to write the test questions. And then they can look through the prototype and make sure that the copy in a prototype is actually your first iteration of the real copy. So what you don't want is your prototype to be a bunch of placeholder copy and then think you're going to put in the real copy later, because then you didn't test the copy. The copy is a huge part of the experience for users. They need to be able to understand it. They need to be able to follow it. So I can't say this enough. When you have a prototype, make sure you are not using lorem ipsum. Make sure you are not using just like, you know, unofficial copy, because users will not get through that prototype test as fast, as efficiently. They won't understand things. They'll get caught up on a poor instruction, and you'll waste a lot of time and you'll miss insights about your test. So please also test your copy when you do prototype testing.
Awesome. We have someone wants to ask you about an error message.
Yes.
Would you like me to read it?
Sure, fire away.
So the error message says, "We're sorry, there's something wrong with our servers. Please check your internet connection and try again."
Great.
Clear and concise and helpful.
Yes. And here's why. Error messages absolutely should always say what happened and tell users how to fix it. So the worst type of error message is the type that says there's a problem, but doesn't say how to fix it. So any error message that says, here is your next step to fix this problem, user, that user is going to just follow that path and is going to continue on and hopefully fix their own problem. One of the things we absolutely don't ever want is a dead end. So in other words, if we have a message and it says, hey user, you need to do this thing. It might not even be an error, it might be an instruction. So if we say, hey user, go and do this thing, but guess what? The user doesn't know how to get there. So we need to provide a link. We need to always have the step. What is the next step? And any error message that includes that next step is pretty darn good.
Great. I want to be mindful of your time as well. So we still have more questions. Would you like me to go on?
I am free. Yes, ask away.
All right. So let's continue. This one is about the job market for juniors.
Yeah.
Junior UX writers.
Yes.
How do you see that? The question is about Silicon Valley, but I think this applies everywhere because it's still
I think
a new
so
field.
too. Yes. So, okay, a couple things about that. Being a junior anything is really hard. Everybody wants the pros, right? But how do you get experience and how do you build that knowledge? So a couple things about that. It's It's hard to break in, but the more you know, the easier it will be. So self-education is very important. As a hiring manager, when I'm looking through resumes, here's what not to do. Don't take your support writing or your marketing writing or some other kind of writing that you've done and just plop UX writer in your title. And not, you need a portfolio and you need design examples. So make sure you do the work to actually show that you're familiar with design and UX and not just a writer who's interested in working in tech. Another thing about breaking into the field, I am super, super passionate about bringing in underrepresented people. And one of the ways to do that is through the creative side of tech. So we know we have a lot of people who love to code. Those people who love to code are hugely, overwhelmingly men. So if we want to get more women and a more diverse group of people working on products, UX is an awesome place to come into that. And in order to break in, you just want to make sure that you have the basic understandings of the design process. You're familiar with design terms. You understand who the people are in a product team and in a design team. And a lot of this is available for you to learn if you just put your mind to it. You can also take our course. I know I've said that before. Yeah, and then about being a junior writer, for example, I mentioned it's good to start with one writer who can come in and guide your whole team. That one writer everybody thinks has to be super senior, but that one writer doesn't have to be super senior. So if you're working at a company and you think you need a writer, please don't be afraid to hire a junior writer who has the skills and the knowledge that you need, even if they've never done the work before, because when you're a writer and you have this mindset that I went through in this whole presentation, you're going to contribute to the team and you're going to learn as you go. That writer is going to be able to build you a style guide and advise the team on standard language, grammar, spelling, preferred terms. So don't be afraid if you're on a team to hire a junior person. And if you're a junior person, make sure you know everything I just said. Make sure you know how to build a style guide so that you can come into a team and hit the ground running and be helpful right away.
Awesome. Okay, so the next question is about the pay. So writers versus designers, UX writers versus UX designers. Is it the same pay or paid less or more?
So, wow, that's a hard question. Because there are so many variables, right? Mm-hmm. When you are working in Silicon Valley, the cost of living here is insane. They have to pay high salaries or you can't live here. So obviously you get paid more in places like Seattle or the San Francisco Bay Area than you would in Tennessee or, maybe in Spain. So when you're talking about pay, it should be roughly equivalent to a designer's pay. So when you are a junior designer, you might be kind of scrappy. You're picking up freelance jobs. Maybe you're working for, this will be in US dollars, but maybe you're working for $40 an hour, or you're working for $60 an hour if you're quick. Once you get into a role that is more official, your experience with UX is just as valuable as a designer's. And because you're going to be doing all of this work connecting between product management and the technical writers and the designers and the marketers and the support people, this role is key and part of that should reflect in the pay. So a good designer and a good writer, in my mind, are absolutely equivalent. If you get into leadership, you'll find that they are equivalent. And if you get into senior roles, they are equivalent. one of the things that happens is junior writers and designers trying to get experience will often just lowball. Maybe they'll work for $20 an hour because they just want some experience. That's fine. Do what you got to do, but you should expect to make roughly what a designer makes.
This one is a bit generic, but it says, like, how can we find distinctive words to make it sound more human? Or how can we make our words sound more human?
Mm-hmm.
How can we learn this or do this as writers?
So this is almost going to sound dumb, but I truly believe it. When you write a string, a little instruction, or a notification, read it out loud. And then pretend you are talking to your best friend or to your mom or dad or to your child. Do they understand it? Did you use a term that makes them go, what? And if you did, how can you simplify it? How can you make it sound friendly? So we want to use terms and words and language that are simple and friendly. One of the questions that I get sometimes is, but I'm writing for doctors, and doctors, we need to sound more formal. The truth is, no, you don't. When you are talking to doctors, they're just like any other user. They need to get stuff done. They need the writing to be simple and to the point. They want to read friendly copy. They don't want to feel like you're talking at them in this formal, professional, corporate voice. They also want to feel like you're on their side, like you are working with them and like you're guiding them through the experience in a friendly way. So the one thing I would say is you will always use your customer's language. If doctors use advanced terms and they understand them, include them in your writing. That's okay. Engineers or developers, when you're writing for engineers and developers, they will have specialized language. Use it. They understand it. That's okay. But don't be formal. Don't say, please, Mr. Doctor of the very high professional level, I would like to speak with you about a thing that I need you to do in our software, right? We want to keep it simple, friendly, straightforward for any user. I don't know if that helps, but.
Amazing. I think that's a very simple way to explain it.
Yeah.
So this one is for writing UX case studies. Any advice for incorporating UX writing when writing a case study?
So yes, I do have advice about that. And it actually ties back to the way your portfolio is written. When I am a hiring manager and I look at someone's portfolio, I'm going to get a sense of their voice and their personality. So first things first, apply UX writing principles to your portfolio. Write in a friendly way. Welcome people, let them know what you're like. Do you also like mountain biking? Do you also have kids that you hang out with and love that? We are literally people working together. And I think the more that we just are authentic and we connect on an authentic level, and we don't worry about impressing people so much, but more talk to them like, I have a skill you need. I can help your company. I can work with your team. I can be super useful. So that's sort of how I would look at, how you're talking in your portfolio even. When you write a case study, as I mentioned, include your rationale, because as a hiring manager, that helps me understand that you know the principles, that you know the rules, that you've consulted the guide for that company, and you help to contribute to it even. So those are some of the things I would look for.
Awesome. The next one is a quick one. I actually like that question. For a CTA button, is it log in or log in?
That's so funny. Okay, so let's talk about those. Sign in, sign up, log in, log out, all of these. Write this down because this is an easy rule once you understand it. If it is a thing, it's a noun, then it's one word. If it is an action, it's two words. So if I say on a CTA button, log in, 2 words, because it's a verb. If I say, visit our login screen, then it's 1 word, because we're calling it login and it's a thing. So this is the way to think about 1 word or 2 words. It's either a thing or an action. If it's a thing, it's 1 word. Action, it's 2 words. Sometimes things are hyphenated, but not very often.
Awesome. Okay, I think this is the last question.
Okay.
The tone of voice. So not every brand differentiates between voice and tone. There is also a phrase called tone of voice. So someone who is a beginner in the field, they get confused between this. Is it tone of voice, or is voice different than a tone?
Yeah, that's a good question. So you can think of it as the voice is the choice of words that you use regularly. So what you call things, what you call customers, how you address people, your common language choices across your whole experience, that's your voice. So a brand voice might be upbeat. A brand voice might be a little cheeky, you know, like maybe, I don't know, Slack has a very fun, kind of whimsical sort of voice. Tone is the emotional sound of those words. So in other words, you might say our voice guide tells us to call fraud, for example. We don't want to say, hey, customer, we are accusing you of possible fraud. That's a bad voice. So instead we would say, we call this a security risk. Okay, so maybe that's the voice you chose. Dear customer, we have seen a security risk on your account. So if you say, dear customer, hey, what's up? We found a security risk on your account. That's the tone is too happy. So the tone is the emotional weight of the words. And if we say, dear customer, we noticed a security risk. We would like to address this right away to ensure that your account is not being hacked or something. We don't want to sound like we're being happy. We want to sound serious, and that's the tone. So tone of voice is really just a longer way to say tone. Voice and tone are very closely related. Voice is really the way we think about talking to each other in general. It's almost like a persona, right? A persona is a voice. And then the tone is how that voice shifts emotionally.
Mm-hmm.